Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lecture Series. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Dr. Mark Grover, Latin American librarian and bibliographer in the Harold B. Lee Library at BYU, deliver an address entitled Elder A. Theodore Tuttle and the Growth of the LDS Church in South America. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures title series is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Dr. Mark Grover is a Lusophile of long standing. A native of Malad, Idaho, he served a mission for the church in Brazil, and upon his return to America, embarked on his life's vocation of studying Brazilians and Latin America. He earned a baccalaureate degree and a Master of Library Science degree from BYU in 1971 and 1973, respectively, a Master of Arts degree in Latin American History from Indiana University, from which institution he earned a PhD in Latin American Historical Nationalism in 1985. Shortly before completing his studies at Indiana, Dr. Grover returned to BYU, where he became and remains the Latin American and Iberian Studies bibliographer. His publications have spanned 2 decades of research into the history and popular culture in South America, and his involvement in the seminar on the acquisition of Latin American library materials has been significant and meaningful. He has also produced important contributions to the history of the church in Latin America, including an article on Parley P. Pratt's 1951 mission to Chile. Few know the church in Latin America better than Dr. Grover, whose love for the people of South America clearly extends to his lovely wife, Evelise, who is here with him today. And they are the blended parents of 4 children. It is with great pleasure that we welcome today's House of Learning lecturer, a model scholar librarian, and my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Grover.
Very happy to be here. Before I start, I'd like to just recognize how honored we are to have Sister Marnay Tuttle with us today, the widow of Elder Tuttle and family members. She and I met a little over 8 years ago, and when we talked about the project of writing a book about her and Elder Tuttle's experience in South America, she opened her home and her life to a inquisitive historian, and I have probed her family history, and it's been a wonderful pleasure. I'm happy to say that she's also been very patient, waiting for this book to be published. Not sure she was going to be alive when it finally came out, but it will be out next month, actually. Very happy to announce that. Secondly, I just want to point out this presentation was made with the idea of it being an academic presentation, and consequently, There's limited mention of what the spiritual aspect of this experience, and I think for those that were participating, they may be a little disappointed that that isn't mentioned more. And I just want to mention that that spiritual aspect is very important in this whole process. Anyway, what Elder Tuttle was feeling on this day, this fall day in 1960, did not seem right, nor did it fit into his plans. South America was not supposed to be his destiny. As a recently called general authority of the church, the young 41-year-old farm boy from Manti, Utah, was on an unusual assignment to tour South America for 3 months, beginning on October 13, 1960. He accompanied the president of the Quorum of the 12, Joseph Fielding Smith, and his wife, Jessie Evans Smith. The reason he thought he was asked to go was, quote, to carry their bags, end quote. After being on ship for several days and after having read half of the Book of Mormon, focusing on the promises concerning the inhabitants of the Americas, he had an experience that both surprised and unsettled him. One day, as he said his evening prayers, he had the distinct impression come upon him, quote, you are going to be in South America, and you are going to preside in that area. His response, oh no, not me. He then stated, so in my prayer, I told the Lord, no, I won't go. Thus began an evening which he described as a wrestle with the Lord. Elder Tuttle placed before him all of the reasons not to go. He wasn't qualified. He didn't know the language. He didn't know anything about the place, and frankly, he didn't want to know anything about it. He had never served as a mission president. He had 6 young children, and they had just moved into their new home in Pleasant Grove, Utah, designed to be their dream home. Finally, his wife, Marnay, was pregnant with her 7th child, and it didn't appear to be a good time to be thinking about going to South America. He needed more time. On and on the reasons multiplied as he continued his pleading prayer. He stayed on his knees for a long time, but to no avail. Finally, when no alternative was offered him, he promised the Lord, quote, all right, I'll do it, and I'll do it gladly. It was with this reluctance that one of the great and unique missionary stories of the church began. Elder A. Theodore Tuttle, the youngest general authority at the time, was soon to be called on a 4-year mission as president of the South American Mission. It was a mission with no missionaries, except two or three, but with responsibility to supervise the 5 soon-to-be 6 South American missions. It was not like the early missions of Brigham Young or of Wilford Woodruff, but because he would not actually be on the street proselyting very much, but in many ways it was of equal importance to the church. It was a key event that has stimulated a process resulting in monumental changes in the evolution of the church in the 20th century. Presently, the importance of Latin America for the church as a whole is very obvious. This is something that has occurred very recently. In 1960, Latin America, including Mexico, had almost 35,000 members of a total 1,693,000 members of the church, which was about 2% of the church, of the entire church. There are 8 missions, no stakes, and no temples. As of the beginning of 2007, a total of 4,874,209 baptized members of the church, of a total almost 13 million, live in Latin America, which is almost 38%. There are 111 missions, 809 stakes, and 34 temples. There are more than 1 million each in Mexico and in Brazil, and if the current trend of growth continues, by 2020, more than 50% of the church will live in Latin America. To the outside world, Mormonism may seem as an American church, but it is going through a Latinization that is extraordinary. The growth of the church in South America is due to several factors, both inside and outside of the church. Over the past 50 years, Latin American societies have experienced significant growth and social change. Prior to the mid-1900s, Latin America was primarily, had a large rural part of its society in which social and economic change occurred very slowly. As such, the connection between what was culturally Latin American and the Catholic Church was so strong that making a religious change away from Catholicism was paramount to rejecting one's national culture. The economic and social changes of the late 1950s to the present, including migrations to cities like this, education and other societal factors, have so changed Latin American society that for a large percentage of the population, the strong cultural connection to this traditional society has been weakened or in some cases completely eliminated. Consequently, the resulting psychological and emotional changes have made many Latin Americans susceptible to religious change. These social shifts, combined with political changes of the 1980s to alter the relationship between the national culture and the Catholic Church, to the point that it is possible that, and even desirable, to change religion and not feel that one is leaving one's culture. The social changes that occurred in Latin America, which made religious change possible, are important but not the only reason for the growth of the LDS Church or any church in Latin America. Beyond the personal spiritual aspects of religious change, which I will not explore at this time, is the issue of how a religion or a church responds to the changes. If any religion has an aggressive proselyting program of any type, it will probably grow in Latin America because there exists such a large pool of potential converts. Thus, to understand the micro-history of the LDS Church in South America, one must focus on the internal evolution of the church within the secular environment in which the church is functioning. In this, I will focus my presentation on a 5-year period of the church in South America between 1960 and 1965. But I'd like to start by briefly describing 4 general time periods in the history of the church in South America. The first is from 1925 to 1960, and these dates I can change and move them back and forth a little bit. The introduction of the church in in South America occurred in 1925. President Heber J. Grant approved a vacation trip of the church historians Andrew Jensen and asked him to make recommendations of where missionaries should be sent in Latin America. Elder Jensen visited most of South America and recommended Argentina, not the South American countries with an indigenous population. A couple of years later, a group of German members immigrated from Germany to Buenos Aires, wrote letters to Salt Lake City asking for missionaries, and 3 general authorities, Apostle Melvin J. Ballard, Elders Ray L. Pratt, and Rulon Wells of the First Council of the 70, then began missionary work on December 6, 1925. Elder Wells soon became ill and returned home, so the 2 missionaries that are pictured here, Elder Pratt and Elder Ballard, remained. The work quickly switched from the German members to a much larger Spanish and Italian-speaking population of the country. After 6 months' mission, these general authorities were replaced by Reinhold Stuf, a German convert who did not speak Spanish or Italian, and he believed that the reason he was called to be president of the South American mission was to work with German immigrants. When he realized that the German-speaking population of Argentina was small and dispersed, he then sent missionaries to southern Brazil in 1928, where there existed large numbers of German immigrants together in German colonies. The language of the church remained German until the early 1940s, when governmental policies forbade the use of non-Portuguese languages in public meetings, and the mission slowly and painfully converted to a Portuguese-speaking mission. You can see the dates of introduction of the church in Mexico and South America. Frederick Williams, an early missionary and former mission president in Argentina who had lived in Uruguay, suggested to President George Albert Smith that missionaries be sent to Uruguay. And in 1947, he then opened the Uruguayan mission as president. And some of you may recognize the young man on the top and next to his father. That's Professor Williams from our Portuguese department here on campus. And then in 1949, he asked for permission to send missionaries to Paraguay, which was granted, and then missionaries then were sent to Chile and Peru in 1957. Now, during this period, up until about the 1960s, South America remained a distant outpost of the church. There was little expectation that the church would grow much in these countries. This is the first chapel in Joinville, and the top is where the church began, just above the bar there. It says the great missionary of the 19th century had occurred in northern Europe. During the early 20th century, ideas had settled in the minds of many members and some leaders in the United States that it was in Northern Europe that most of the descendants of Israel could be found. Many believed there would be few converts from the southern European Catholic countries of Italy, Spain, and Portugal, or the Latin American countries, which have a large number of their ancestors, of their people. Consequently, an erroneous belief developed that suggested the gathering of Israel had already happened and that the church was just waiting for a few last prophetic events to occur, such as taking the gospel to the Lamanites, before the final wrapping up of events of the world would occur. These expectations left many feeling that there was not much of a future for the church in South America. Consequently, this was a long period in South America that was characterized by limited member growth, limited institutional development, and frankly, few expectations. That all changed then with the presidency of David O. McKay beginning in 1951. President McKay believed that much yet had to occur, particularly away from the center in Salt Lake, before the end. His world tour of the missions in the early 1950s focused attention on the worldwide church. His emphasis on missionary work revitalized a program that had experienced some challenges. He visited the members in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil and was impressed with what he saw. He came away believing that the church in South America was on the verge of a potential great growth. He then began to send general authorities to visit South America annually. These visitors were apostles and influential leaders of the church, such as President Stephen L. Richards of the First Presidency, apostles Mark E. Peterson, Hugh B. Brown, Harold B. Lee, Henry D. Moyle, Joseph Fielding Smith, and Spencer W. Kimball. All returned to Salt Lake City with a better understanding and appreciation of South America, but more importantly, with a feeling that there was a potential for growth and development in the region. So this new understanding of international Mormonism then which was established by President McKay and his counselor Henry D. Moyle, and then continued by President Spencer W. Kimball. These three men had a broad vision of a worldwide church with growth, expanding congregations, and temples throughout the world. In Latin America, a strong institutional foundation then was established during this time period with the organization of stakes, expansion of missionary work, and the building of temples. The next time period is from 1978 to 2000. This is a period of monumental growth and development in South America, in which the church grew from just a little bit less than 600,000 to 2,548,000 in 12 years. Can you imagine what that meant in terms of just development of the church and institutional things that had to happen? It expanded into every country and every region of South America. The two important events of this period was the priesthood revelation of 1978 and the administrative decentralization of the church with the organization of area presidencies in 1984. Then the last is then the 2000 to the present, where growth and expansion continues but at a slower rate, and it drops basically to the church-wide levels of growth. It was a time of retrenchment in some areas and normalization, with a focus on strengthening the organizations of the church. This maturation is demonstrated by just the number of temples that were built during this time period. In 2000, 7 temples were functioning, and then during that time period, 27 additional temples were built, included, 28 now with the announcement of the temple in Córdoba. So now I want to focus on this critical period in this evolution, a short 4 years, when for the first time a general authority was transferred from Salt Lake City to live in South America. Elder A. Theodore Tuttle was a member of the First Quorum of the 70, and he was assigned to go and chose to live in Uruguay, and he directed the missions and the church from his office in Carrasco, a suburb of Montevideo, Uruguay. In 4 years, he was able to take the vision of President McKay and establish those ideas in the minds of church leaders, missionaries, and members. These mental changes were the beginning of a process that changed the church forever in South America. Most that has happened in the church down in South America since then was contemplated by Elder Tuttle, including the recent Perpetual Education Fund. Elder Tuttle was born and raised in Manti, Utah, and he was a little bit different than most of the young men in Manti. His mother had a promise to fulfill. Having children was not easy for Clarice Tuttle, and fearing that she would not have a son, she prayed to the Lord with a promise. If you can grant me a son, I will bring him up to serve the Lord. When that prayer was answered with the birth of Albert Theodore on March 2nd, 1919, her goal was to comply with her Hannah-like promise, and she was successful. Ted Tuttle was active in the church and did well in school. He was both the seminary and class president in high school. He attended Snow College for 2 years and then served a mission to the Northern States Mission headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. He returned home in September of 1941. He graduated from BYU and married Marnay Whitaker, and then served in World War II, participating in the invasion of Hiroshima. His goal was to teach seminary, and after getting out of the military, he was hired to teach at Midway High School in Manan, Idaho, a small farming community between Idaho Falls and Rexburg. He also taught in Brigham City, Davis High School, and the Institute at the University of Nevada at Reno. Then in 1953, he was named as one of 2 supervisors of the Seminary and Institute programs, along with his friend and colleague, Boyd K. Packer. 5 years later, in April of 1958, he was called as a general authority to serve in the First Council of 70. His early responsibilities as a general authority included, among other things, working in the missionary department under the direction of President Henry D. Moyle and with Elder Gordon B. Hinckley. As mentioned before, then in 1960, he went with President Joseph Fielding Smith to South America, and because of that experience that I've described, then he realized he would be returning to South America. So he was very observant of what was happening and made extensive notes on areas and things that he would work on. After returning from that trip, within the year he was assigned to return and live full-time as part of a semi-pilot project of having a general authority live internationally away from Salt Lake City. At the same time, Elder Alvanar Dyer was living in Europe with a similar assignment. So Elder Tuttle and his family lived in South America from 1961 to 1965 and then returned to the United States when supervision of the region again returned to general authorities living in Salt Lake. The concept of an in-region general authority was to be adopted church-wide in the mid-1970s, and Elder Faust, James E. Faust, returned to Brazil. Elder Tuttle was young, energetic, and full of life. He had the title of President of the South American Mission and took that responsibility seriously. He immediately unified the missions of the region. He spent most of his time visiting throughout the 6 countries and 7 missions. He talked frequently with mission presidents and interviewed every missionary regularly. Among the mission presidents were those that were there were 2 future general authorities, Elder William Grant Bangerter and Thomas Fyans, and if you notice in this picture, President Palmer, who was on campus here for several years. So the most significant, the consequence of these 4 years that he spent in South America was more psychological than organizational, although that was important. He was able to implant in the minds of general authorities in Salt Lake City, missionaries and members in South America, the belief that the LDS Church not only could, but would develop and grow into an organization that was similar and equal to the church in the United States. This change in vision then can be seen in several ways. First is that an advocate for South America in Salt Lake City. Because of the small size of the church in South America, there had historically been limited information about the region that reached the leadership, bureaucracy, and membership of the church in general. The few thousand members in South America was a modest number in comparison with the membership in most other regions of the world. As a result, South America was seldom written about in the magazines of the church, and only limited references on South America was available to the membership in general. That all changed with Elder Tuttle. He felt an important part of his responsibility was to be an advocate and spokesman for South America within the leadership of the church in Salt Lake. During this time, he came to Salt Lake 5 times. His visits always included an interview with President David O. McKay and meetings with the 12 apostles in which he described what was happening in South America. He constantly reminded the church leaders that South America was a land of promise, of prophecy. During his 5 visits, he spoke at 4 general conferences, and all 4 of his talks were related to South America. Not only did he speak in conference, but he also gave a devotional here at BYU. The excitement that he exhibited and the love that he expressed for the members were important factors in generating positive feelings in Salt Lake about South America. Perhaps more important was that he established contact with the bureaucracy in Salt Lake City. It took the form of requests for information, help, and assistance in the implementation of church programs. Those letters went to many different departments of the church, not just to the missionary department, which had been the prior practice. And as a general authority, his success with church departments was much greater than it was for mission presidents, because it was more problematic to turn down a general authority if you're in the bureaucracy. An important event in his advocacy of the church was the publication of several articles about South America in the May 1963 issue of the Church's adult magazine, The Improvement Era. It was not just one article, but a special issue with 8 different articles. A beautiful picture of the archaeological ruin of Machu Picchu, Peru was on the cover, and numerous photographs accompanied the pictures. Elder Tuttle's introductory article highlighted the region, and there were separate write-ups for each mission. It was a large section that was seldom done and for other topics or geographic regions. It was one of the most important descriptions of South America available to the church, published to the present time. In my mind, it was a signal to the membership that the church in South America was becoming more important. Secondly, is a change of vision for South Americans. The major difference in South America in its 35-year history prior to Elder Tuttle's mission and the period after was that of vision and perception. What occurred was a change in belief about what could happen in the church. It was difficult for members and missionaries to believe the church in South America had the potential for growth and development into an organization that might be compared to what the church was in the United States. Small branches, meeting in homes made into chapels with congregations of primarily youth, single women, and a few complete families, were not the makings of wards and stakes. There was talk about stakes, church schools, and welfare programs, but it was always about the church in the United States. Few members had hopes of seeing these things in South America. Many, unable to wait, immigrated to the United States so they could have what they believed was the full blessings of the gospel. Elder Tuttle was so positive about the potential growth and development of the church that his enthusiasm was catching. As a general authority, when Elder Tuttle talked of changes that would occur in South America, he was believed. The primary reason was that things actually began to happen. He and the mission presidents talked in time periods and dates of completion. Dates for the organization of stakes were given. It was not just idle talk. The members could see that he was making goals that were possible. Most important of these activities, I believe, was the construction of chapels. Members had seen pictures of church buildings in the United States, but never in person. When the first chapels were built in South America, during this period, they were large, spacious, and beautiful, equal to those that they had seen in the pictures. They became tangible evidence of the fulfillment of President Tuttle's expectations. Along with chapel constructions was the development of local leaders. When missionaries were taken out of leadership positions in the branches and districts in large numbers, and members began to function in their place, the dream of stakes became a possibility. The next is the implementation of church programs. President Tuttle ensured that all missions were following the programs of the church, but more important, his presence meant that the programs of the church actually reached South America. There had been a tendency in the past to institute certain programs in areas where the church was well established, but not to the membership as a whole, including South America. It was understandable since the small size of congregations in Latin America and South America meant that the members required to support many of the programs just were not available. But President Tuttle was anxious to have the complete program of the church made available to the members in South America. One of his primary goals was the organization of stakes, and he talked often about temples in South America. And his program included an important translation of church manuals and instructions, which had not been occurring, was done in the missions. And then he was also anxious for the introduction of a church school system in Chile that was similar to, though smaller than, a program in Mexico. The next is the decentralization of church administration. The historical centralization of decisions in Salt Lake City related to South America prior to his coming made administration of the missions a little difficult. The fact that a mission president had to write to the first presidency for permission to buy a heating unit for the mission home was an example of the difficulty and time required for management of the church from afar. The experience of Elder Tuttle in the 1960s showed in a very visual and vivid way the value of decentralizing administrative functions to the regional units. He demonstrated what could happen if a general authority was put in a region and given authority to make decisions. And then he showed the value of the presence of a general authority in the country and spiritually affecting the lives of members. And what you see here is a local member in Uruguay taking responsibility for instruction. The fifth is the promise to the Lamanites. Church leaders have always had somewhat of an ambivalence as to how to implement the perceived responsibility to the descendants of Lehi. Though most church leaders recognized that Latin America had a significant large number of Native Americans, the emphasis of the church programs and missionary work historically was focused towards the native populations in the United States. This emphasis resulted in some frustration by church leaders because of the lack of success amongst this population. During his first trip to South America, Elder Tuttle developed specific ideas on how these programs would be fulfilled. Though the focus of missionary work in South America during this time was primarily on European immigrants, he worked hard to increase activity amongst the Native Americas of the Andes particularly. Missionaries were sent into Bolivia during his last year, and he began the process of sending missionaries to Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia. Elder Tuttle constantly emphasized that the time for the blessings of the Lamanites to be realized was then, when he was there. Part of his ideas on the Native American was a concern over what he considered to be the reasons for the serious social and economic problems that they suffered. He constantly talked against the spread of communism, which he felt was negatively affecting the area, and the role of the Catholic Church in subverting the population. But one of his greatest frustrations, I think, was that more wasn't done with the indigenous population. He worked very hard on it. The last is the image of the church. Elder Tuttle was concerned about how the church appeared to the non-Mormon population. Unfortunately, its image was more like that of a small, strange sect than of a legitimate church. He struggled to change that image. The building of several homes and offices on what is called Mormon Block, and that's this area right there. And the present temple, Uruguayan temple, is on this end right over there. So, anyway, building of several homes in Uruguay was an important symbolic act meant to persuade others that the church was more middle class than it appeared by seeing the inadequate meeting places of the members. The building of large, beautiful Wasatch Front-like chapels also worked towards changing that image. He encouraged media activities that presented the church in a positive way. There was also a concerted effort to improve the social level of the baptisms that were occurring in the church. Elder Tuttle continually emphasized the importance of baptizing complete families. He suggested that the baptism of a middle-class man with administrative experience was important for the church. He encouraged missionary work among the population that had more money and more prestige, and was pleased when families who owned cars joined the church, which was unusual at that time. He believed that if the social level of the church could be upgraded, then the success of the church would increase. President Tuttle and the mission presidents in these 7 missions put the church in South America on a launching pad for future growth. In 1961, at the time of the first South American Mission Conference, there were 15,475 baptized members of the church in South America. At about this time Elder Tuttle left, that number had increased to 67, a little over 67,000, more than tripling the membership of the church. 45% of the new converts were male. Prior to his coming, most of the units of the church were led by missionaries, with the exceptions being a few branches in the larger capital cities. But when Elder Tuttle left, the mission organization had been completely separated from the member districts organization, and the two were functioning separately, and most branches were presided over by local members. During his 4 years, 19 chapels were dedicated and 43 were under construction in 1965. There were full-time schools operating in Chile. After leaving Montevideo in 1965, President Tuttle was never far away from South America, though his assignments took him to other parts of the world, one of which was as president of the Provo Temple. A part of him stayed in South America. In the mid-1970s, he returned to serve as an area supervisor for Eastern South America and lived in Quito, Ecuador. In 1964, he was called as the first area president for the South America South area, which included Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile. During this time in Buenos Aires, he became ill and came home for a month to have medical tests done. Doctors determined that he had a spot on his intestines that was infected due to bacteria that had been accumulating for many years. He didn't return to Buenos Aires, but stayed in Utah to fight the problem. The following year, he was spent working and recuperating in the United States. Then in the spring of 1986, the doctors discovered cancer near his pancreas. Chemotherapy and radiation treatments shrunk the cancer, but the reduced tumor pulled away from the pancreas, creating a bleeding wound that, because of the unusual position, could not be cauterized. An operation was not possible. That wound would heal and then bleed, so Elder Tuttle required numerous blood transfusions. Death then was imminent. As the in 1986 General Conference approached, he was seriously ill but wanted to talk. He spoke in the last session on Sunday. Saturday evening before, he received a blood transfusion and a visit by his close friend and neighbor, Apostle Boyd K. Packer. As he got up to speak, his weakened physical appearance was obvious to the audience. There had not been an official announcement concerning his illness, and most were surprised. I have just a part of the last part of his talk.
I bear you my humble witness that I know that God lives. I know that He lives, that He is our Father, that He loves us. I bear witness that Jesus is the Christ, our Savior and our Redeemer. And I understand better what that means now. I am grateful for His atonement in our behalf and for knowing something about our relationship to Him and to our Heavenly Father and the meaning and purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm grateful for the prophet Joseph Smith. I know he was a prophet. And I know that President Ezra Taft Benson is a living prophet today, and bear that witness in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
A flood of messages and letters came to the Tuttles expressing their love for him and faith in his recovery. On Friday morning, November 28, 1986, after having talked to all of his children, he quietly passed away. He was 67 years old and had served as a general authority for 27 years. In his funeral, he was described by President Ezra Taft Benson as, quote, a man of peace and gentleness, one whom the Lord loves and has magnified. I think it's appropriate that during his last few weeks, his thoughts were focused south to South America and Latin America. Perhaps during these last few weeks, he reviewed some of his experiences in South America. He probably pictured in his mind the majesty of the Andes Mountain, whose beauty and grandeur so impressed him. He would have thought of the beautiful city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where the combination of the city, mountains, tropical forests, and ocean is such a stunning sight. He probably remembered his many visits to the city of Buenos Aires, with its beautiful buildings, parks, and streets. And he definitely would have remembered the Carrasco area of the city of Montevideo, where the family lived and an area that he loved so dearly. In conclusion, when he arrived in 1961, South America represented 1.5% of the church and was established in 6 countries. 40 years later, that number had grown to more than 24% of the church, just South America. Elder Tuttle's role in that growth was that of a starter and an attitude changer, convincing general authorities and members alike that South America no longer should be considered a small outpost of the church. For that role, he is honored throughout South America and throughout the church. Such is the legacy of a small Utah farm boy, son of a sheep herder from Manti, Utah. I just want to explain this picture. Elder Tuttle loved horses, and they owned horses when he lived in Pleasant Grove, but of course could not take those horses with him to South America. His missionaries, I think for his birthday, gave him this horse. And they were living, of course, in a growing residential area, but still they gave him this horse. A few years ago, I was standing in the kitchen of their home, and one of his missionaries explained to me that when he got so tired of being in the office, he would go outside, saddle up his horse, and sit on that horse to rest, and sometimes to give interviews. And so this horse is, very important. Anyway, thank you so much.